Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And we're going to be talking a lot of politics and innovation, particularly about education today, with my guest, Jeff Sandefer. He is the founder of Acton Academy. Jeff, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks, Robert. Great to be here.
Now, I didn't warn you. This is a total ambush, and we're friends. Our sons are friends, but I didn't warn you that guests on this podcast introduce themselves. So you have a long CV, you've sent me your bio, but imagine you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, you have 60 seconds to introduce yourself. Go.
Yeah, well, I am a entrepreneur and a Socratic teacher. And so I've founded a number of businesses, but I've spent the last 35 years not only doing business, but also as a Socratic teacher at the graduate school level. And then, as I think we're going to talk about today, I spent 13 years as a full-time middle school and high school teacher. Now we call them guides, and we'll get into all that. But so I've spent a lot of my time in the classroom asking questions, and the time I don't spend doing that, I've spent starting businesses.
Good. Well, that was less than 60 seconds. And you're also married to Laura Sandefer, who helped co-found Acton Academy, and you have two kids. And so anyway, that was how we met, was through Acton Academy. My son Jacob went to Acton it's almost 10 years ago. So we're friends. We've been friends for a while, but I'm pleased to have you on the podcast. Acton Academy you started this idea of the Socratic method in a one-room schoolhouse. I'm abbreviating what the idea behind this is, in 2010, and now you're up to 270 campuses. Is that right? In how many countries?
Well, the number keeps growing. We're at about 325 now in 26 countries, and I think last count 42 U.S. states.
Well, that's remarkable growth for any business to go from 13 years from 1 to 325, right? I mean, if you're a franchise selling tacos or, burgers or, clothing or something, that, 1 to 325 in 13 years as a business, right, would be pretty remarkable growth. But Acton Academy is a nonprofit, is it not, for a 501c3?
It is. So we're a not-for-profit. Even more remarkably, we've had 18,000 auditions from parent entrepreneurs who want to start an Acton. So 18,000 people have raised their hand and said, I want to start one. We've only had the capacity so far to start 325. So there's a lot more growth to happen.
So tell us then, so very as briefly as you can, and I know you've talked about this, and I was watching part of your interview with Jordan Peterson. You interviewed with him in March. What is Acton Academy, and why has it had this incredible traction in the marketplace of ideas around education?
Well, I've got to go back to the start for just a second, because we started this for our own two boys, who and we started with 7 young people and a blank sheet of paper and a one-room schoolhouse. So everything that has happened has been by trial and error, not by design.
And that was, by the way, that was here in Austin, Texas, where you did this.
It was in Austin, Texas. Trial and error, one step at a time. We never thought we would have a middle school, much less a middle school, and as we call it, a launch pad, which is the high school, nor would we even have one more Acton. But so there's a whole story of how this happened through trial and error, but it's really just like all of entrepreneurship. Now, the main mission we started with, and our belief still today, is that every child is a genius who deserves to find a calling that will change the world. And it's important, when I say the word genius, people immediately jump to 180 IQ. Now, that's not what the word means. The word means to have an exceptional talent or gift. So, I wish I were 6 feet tall with a full head of hair and looked like Brad Pitt, but this is what I got. I don't have, and so it doesn't matter if you have 180 IQ or a lower IQ. What we believe matters is resilience, grit, getting along with other people, being committed to something. And the way we encapsulate all of that is in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And if you think about the hero's journey, Robert, it's the basis for almost every successful novel or movie. Every Marvel adventure is all the hero's journey. The hero hears a call. They cross the threshold to adventure. They have 3 or 4 battles, and then they either seize the Holy Grail or they don't. And that's the story of Acton. Is we think each child is a hero and is going to go out there and have battles in the world, and we want to equip them for that.
I got to tell you, because as I said, my son Jacob went to Acton. When I heard this whole hero's journey thing at the beginning, I thought, oh, come on. I just thought, that's just sounds on the surface, it sounds hokey. But as you were saying that, it reminds me of that movie. What is every movie script, right? You have the hero gets in trouble. That's the first act. And the second act, the hero gets in more trouble. And then the third act, something happens that changes, the hero, right? But that I mean, I don't know why that comes to mind, but that's the kind of this narrative structure, right? The hero has an adventure and he gets in trouble, and then he gets in even more trouble, and somehow something happens that makes it all worthwhile in the end.
Yeah, I think that resonates because that's the story of each of us, right? We each go out and try something hard and we stumble. Now, the opposite of the hero's journey is victimhood. Poor, powerless me. I can't do anything about this. The world's not fair. Well, of course, the world's not fair. It's not fair at all. But it's on each of us as individuals to go do something about it, and hopefully do that in community while we're serving others. So in a way, it can sound hokey, but I'll tell you, to a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 14-year-old, it doesn't sound hokey at all. It sounds like the way life should be lived. And it's important to say, heroes these days, you think about people on social media, and that hero means prestige or wealth. And we don't believe that at all. We believe being a hero means when you get knocked down, you get back up. So heroes don't always win, but they always get back up, dust themselves off, and walk back into the fight. And so the hero is about being resilient, about caring about something passionate, and doing something in the world.
Well, and it's interesting you framed it that way, because the grievance culture, right? This has been identified today, that everyone has a grievance against whoever is in power, right? That this idea of victimhood is pervasive in our politics. It's a pervasive, I think, on campus, which is part of now this why some of these campus speech debates are so nasty, right? And so they're happening all across the country, right? About who's going to be allowed to speak up and say their mind. But do you see that? And I mean, in general, in U.S. culture or more around the world, this idea of victimhood, and is that one of the reasons why we're seeing this alienation in our culture? And as Jonathan Haidt talks about this, the cloistering, or the disaggregation of society. People are segregating themselves and fighting and not identifying or seeking common ground. We even see it in the GOP in the U.S. House today, which is just beyond stupid in my view. But how do you think about victimhood and this idea of grievance culture more broadly?
Well, I think the important thing is, we're very apolitical at Acton, and we've got people from the left and from the right. And so if you want to ask me, are there great injustices in the world? Absolutely, right? Things that are terribly unfair in the world. And I've been one of the luckiest guys possible, so I'm not one to sit around and say there's no injustice. The question is, what are you going to do about it as an individual? So I'm old enough to be kind of the grumpy old Muppet in the balcony complaining about the world, and young people aren't what they used to be. But that's just not what we see at Acton. I mean, what we see is when you give young people something to passionately believe in, and you give them tools and you trust them to build their own cultures, they build something amazing. So we really don't get into ideology in the sense of trying to inculturate children one way or the other. We just ask questions. We ask questions like, does power corrupt? It's an interesting question, right? Well,
right.
Times. Okay, when? Okay, how do you keep it from corrupting you? What corrupting thoughts have you had? So it's basically about asking questions and letting young people choose. And it takes a lot of the politics on the left and the right out of it. So we do say, Robert, that there's 3 things that will stop you from a hero's journey. The first one is resistance. I'm scared. The second is distraction. Wow, look at all the fun stuff on the internet. The third is victimhood. And that there's actually an antidote for every one of those poisons. For resistance and fear, it's take the first step. I'm scared. Okay, let's just take one step together. Let's go one step closer. Okay, well, what about distraction? Well, for distraction, you just have to prioritize. Now, that gets hard because you have to decide what matters when you prioritize, and that's difficult. So we'll give young people a set of questions to work out what matters to them. Then you're not distracted anymore. You're focused. But the third one, the idea of victimhood, poor me, I can't do anything. The antidote for that one's actually interesting. There's only one antidote. It's gratitude.
Yeah.
Poor me, I'm in a terrible place. Possibly true. Other people are in a worse place. Let's be grateful and go out and do something about it. Because when I see people who are homeless or people who have a terrible physical disability, I mean, as you'll know, I was almost killed a couple of years ago and had to kind of relearn how to walk. And there were a lot of people a lot worse off than I was. I mean, but when you look at them, most of those people will get back up and do something about it. And they're out there trying and they're changing, even when they're homeless. They're out there trying to help and serve other people. So we're just trying to pick out the heroes and the hero stories and celebrate them, and then give young people challenges to go out and do something.
So walk us through the business model. Since it's a nonprofit, you're essentially a franchise operation, right? I mean, is that a fair way to think? You're kind of like I'm not going to. This don't mean this in any insulting way, but kind of like a McDonald's. You're selling a franchise to someone who says, "Oh, I want to do that in my town with my, these kids." How does that work?
Okay, so first, my law degree's in the mail, but my understanding, best I can, it cannot be a not-for-profit and be a franchise.
Okay.
TC defines. So we're just careful about that because we really aren't a franchise. Now, are we equipping parents to go out and start these communities? Absolutely. And so the way the business,
but is that, if it's not the right word, if it's not franchise, you say community, but it is that's the similar concept, right? Or is that, I'm not using the wrong term, am I?
No, not at all. No, it's just technically, legally, we're just not.
I gotcha. Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Something technically, it's important. We're more providing people with a kit and a community to go out and build something. So it looks a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous in that we have 320 some odd campuses. We only have one staff member, and Laura and me. So how do you do that? Well, you have to be very decentralized. You have to trust the people you pick. You have to have a very simple program. I mean, Alcoholics Anonymous is one of the greatest not-for-profit stories of time, probably since the early Christian church. We think a lot about Wikipedia and how volunteers create things. So we've really got these parent entrepreneurs who want to build something for their children, and they got real skin in the game, right? Like you had with Jacob. I mean, they really care, and we'll provide them with a kit in a community to go build something. And for that we charge $15,000 plus a 3% fee. Now, what's interesting is every community gives back something to the network, and they're paid for that. And at the end of the period, we pick the very best campuses, the ones that are doing the learner driven the best, and we rebate their fees back to them. So in a way, you pay, but the better you do, the more you get back. And so everyone's incentivized to make the model better as we grow. And the kit just gets better every year.
And the $15,000 is a one-time fee?
Yeah, it's a one-time fee. It's $5,000 for the we don't call it a curriculum. I'll explain why not in a minute, but for the learning challenges. And it's $10,000 to attend orientation, because that's our bottleneck, is how many people can we orient. And so we charge $5,000 each for 2 people to come. And then you're a member of the network. And you might have a fairly small campus, so 3% of the revenues on that is not much. But we have a lot of campuses now that are 100+ learners. I mean, these are real K through 12 large operations, but they grow from very small places.
Well, I know, correct me if I'm wrong here, my wife Lauren taught in Montessori school. I was on the board at Parkside Community School. It was started by my friends Joe and Claire Bruno here in Austin. But your sons went through Montessori early on, if I remember correctly. And the reason I'm asking that is that one of the things you're doing with Acton is multi-age classrooms, right?
Yeah.
That is similar to, I mean, that goes back to the one-room schoolhouse, but it's also one of the features of Montessori. What's the advantage of multi-age classrooms?
Well, the biggest advantage, there's several. One advantage is you can exactly figure out which child is supposed to be doing what at what time. And you might say, well, gosh, that sounds like a disadvantage. But it's an advantage because it allows each child to develop their own skills and their own talents. And you can applaud people doing well in math or reading or building a project. Everybody can win at something. But it's too complicated to figure out if you're really ahead or behind, because there's so many ways to win. that you just have to pick one and go for it. And so what it allows people to do is develop their talents without worrying about too much that Johnny can't read quite as well at age 7 as some other child. I mean, Albert Einstein could barely read at all by age 8. He turned out to do a pretty good job. Thomas Edison, same story. So it gets away from this measuring every child and expecting them to develop in lockstep. And so, you said McDonald's earlier. There's 2 ways to think about children. You can think about them as cogs in a machine that a carpenter or a mechanic hones. And that's how many educators speak of children.
Right.
Whenever I hear that, I say, well, is that what you want for your child? And of course, the answer is no, I don't. We're going to hone them to be productive citizens. Like, was that what you want for your child? No. I want my child to find what they love to do, to be passionate about it, to have friends. And I'm like, well, then why do you want to have other children be cogs? And so the opposite of McDonald's is this idea of these small communities where people are working to build the communities, and they're not cogs. They turn out to be who they were meant to be. It's more like a garden. We're providing the soil for these young people to grow and the freedom. Now, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. Like, in fact, they're probably the most responsible communities you'll ever be in, because the children form their own contracts. As you well know, they run their own studios. These are the most kind of responsible children you'll ever meet because they've been trusted. And I'll tell you one thing we discovered. Children are capable of doing far more than adults think they can. I mean, children are amazing in what they can accomplish. They just dumb it down if you put them in a room of 30 people the same age and talk at them all the time.
So when you say that, what pops in my head, you talked about this idea of honing the cogs, right? So I think of that great Charlie Chaplin image, right, of him in the factory, right? But it's the idea. Well, my friend Joe Bruno, who founded Parkside Community School, talked about it as a government school, right? And he just used those, almost spits those words out. Well, it's government school, but it's also the idea of the school as the factory, right? That the school is churning out workers so they can go in the factory and be the cog in the wheel. So I like that. So is that a fair way to think about it? As you were talking about that, it's the factory model versus the garden model. It's an interesting way is that fair to think about it that way?
And it's very simple. It's just as simple as people aren't cogs. Human beings children are precious human beings. They're just not cogs. So it's exactly the way to think about it. Nothing wrong with having a factory. And by the way, as you and I both know, you go in a modern factory today, it doesn't look like the factories of Henry Ford's time. They're very sophisticated. People aren't doing the same thing all day, every day, the same way. I mean, so working in a factory today is a very complicated thing. It's not like the factories of the 1800s. And yet, in many ways, our educational systems still look like that.
So is that why, you said you want to stay away from politics. Okay, I got that, but I'm going to press you here a little bit. So why are our educational systems doing such a bad job? I mean, we're with the record numbers of record amounts of money. I mean, I know it's record huge amounts of money, tens of thousands of dollars per child are being spent in many school districts across the country, and yet they're failing. Their students are not doing well. Is this part of one of the things I thought about it when I was preparing for our interview is this a function of the failing of the family and the strong 2-parent household? Is it a broader societal failing? Is this just a reflection of the kind of decline of the nuclear family, or is there something? What else? How do you look at this? How do you think about the failure of the school systems across the country?
The short answer is I don't. We're not in the education reform business. We're in the business of serving families. And so Acton's not the answer to every question, but it's the answer to parents who want their children on a hero's journey. And so I'm not in the education reform business. We don't speak at conferences. It's not that we don't care. I hope the system reforms itself, but we're creating something new and different to serve people who want that. And, I think back, I spent time in my earlier years in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was falling apart. And you could have kind of spent all your time inside the Soviet Union trying to remedy it, trying to fix it, trying to reform it, or you could just build something better and lift up the gate and see which way the people go. And that's what happened when the Berlin Wall fell. And so we're just trying to build something better. as something that might serve some people, and the rest of the system is going to have to take care of itself. We're just not in it. I don't criticize the system. I don't attack it. I don't try to figure it out, because that takes away time from adding another 10 or 20 Acton Academies. And when you see these young people come out, as you saw Jacob come out and our sons, what they're capable of doing is just incredible. Hopefully that'll spread, but our mission is just to serve the families we have. It's not to reform education. I can give you all sorts of reasons I think it's messed up, but the truth is, I haven't been in a public school for 13 years. And maybe if I had been, I would have a lot of reforms in mind. I haven't been in the shoes of traditional teachers fighting what they have to fight. I've been in an acting studio, seeing what happens and the magic that happens there. That's about all I can talk about.
Is that part of the success? So fair enough. And I as you say that, I think about my own attitude toward my critics, or, things, I can't address all those issues. So I just don't address them. It's like, there aren't enough hours in the day for me to take on those issues. So I focus on my thing, right? Which I think that makes sense.
We talk a lot at Acton about the shadow. The hero artists had this thing from their backstory that when they see it in other people, it makes them angry. And it's more about myself when I get really mad about something like in the system. And so I try to work more on what is it about myself that's causing that, and let me go do something positive with it rather than projecting it on the system. Look, I could rail on any system you want to mention. I could go negative for a long time.
Well, we only have an hour, Jeff. So let's leave that.
What does it do? I mean, I need to go do something positive about it, and that's what we're equipping these young people to do, is giving them the inspiration and the tools and the questions to go do something positive.
Well, so let's follow up on that, because that was one of the things that there were things obviously that I think my son Jacob learned. He's our youngest, but I think it was ultimately, you got to teach yourself, right? That you can talk about all these other things, you can, whatever, but when it comes down to it, where does the buck stop? The buck stops right here. It's about that whole thing of personal responsibility, which is considered kind of a political thing, right? Oh, the conservatives, right? Well, you have to take personal responsibility. Well, hell yeah. But it's interesting. I'll just give you one quick thought, and then I'll put it back to you. But it was a friend of mine who we knew when we were homeschooling, and his daughter was very bright. She went to Harvard Medical School. And what did she learn there? She had to teach herself, right? That they had all this fancy blah, 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 blah. But ultimately she had to take it on her own self. She might've been at Harvard, right? Very prestigious, but it was up to her. And it was just this one kind of reaffirmation of what we saw as homeschoolers, and we saw at Acton, was that ultimately, where does you kind of make it happen yourself? So but it's, when you said inspiration, that's what brought that to mind, was this idea that ultimately, when it comes down to brass tacks, what you're giving them a place where you're inspiring them to take on their own hero's journey, their own personal responsibility to educate themselves. Is that a fair way to think about kind of the broad concept?
I do think that's fair. That's true. The other thing that comes into that, and I'm more of an individualist, and I trained at the Harvard Business School, so we had the case method, and love being there. I've taught at that level, at the graduate level, Socratically, so I love that kind of approach of asking questions. But what we found at the academy is, it's not just about the individual; it's also about the community. And I think if there's two things that when Jacob or Charlie or Sam come out of school, they've really learned, it's self-management, right? I've got to set goals and reach them. If I want to get something done, I've got to have this self-managing part of me. And then I've also got to have the ability to self-govern. I've got to be able to get a group of people together and either follow a leader or become the leader and get those people to do something. So, at Acton, the young people move at 2 to 3 grade levels every year until they max out the test. So all across Acton, we see that. And nobody cares about the silly test. And the hardest thing we have to do is get people to actually even take the test after a while, because they just don't care. Because they're all they can read, they can write, they can do math. So that's all off the table. But the hard things are the ability to self-manage and self-govern. And that's the thing that you learn day in and day out. How do you learn it? Because you have to manage yourself, and because you have to govern in a community. And, we didn't, by the way, start out with this as a grand plan. This is what we learned, trial and error, time and time again, offering choices to young people of, would you rather do A or would you rather do B? Would you rather try democracy or a benevolent dictatorship to run the studio for a while. And again, it's always a hot mess. It's getting torn apart. It's getting put back together again. Sometimes the whole studio falls apart for 3 weeks and it's Lord of the Flies. And you think, oh, what a bunch of wasted time. And then you look back 5 years later, and the biggest learning happened during that 3 weeks when the studio fell apart. That was the real learning because they had to put it back together
and figure out how to cooperate toward a broader team goal. So it's individual and team at the same time.
Yeah. It's the two. Yeah. You got to have both.
So, but back to the business of the business here. So you have a nonprofit, you have this incoming cash, and you've got only 2 employees at the nonprofit. Well, you know, one thing I know about bureaucracies and having been around nonprofits and NGOs and, you know, the rest of it, the whole goal is, well, you got to grow the budget, right? And we're going to hire more people and we're going to do more of this and that. So you've got this flow of cash coming in. Where does that how do you manage that as a nonprofit?
Well, we manage it, but if you remember earlier, we redistribute it back to the best campuses. So at the end of the day, we're giving that money back, and we're just starting that process now. We're just starting to make enough money to do that. But we're actually, you know, it's almost as if you sign up for a co-op and then you get a rebate at the end of the year if there's a surplus.
Yeah.
So
no, I love co-ops, right? These are one of the backbones of American public power, right? Is that the publicly owned and cooperatively owned power systems.
But the rebate doesn't go back equally to every person. It goes back to the people who contribute the most. So there is a tiered system of how well you're running your studio. I'd say the amazing thing we're seeing on the model side is we've got campuses with 100 to 130 learners with only 2 adults. And so we're seeing the ability for young people to learn at this accelerated rate at a cost that's sometimes as low as $1,000 per learner per year. So you contrasted that earlier with tens of thousands of dollars for traditional schools. I know our daughter she was too old to be at Acton. She went to a private school in Austin that was $40,000 a year. Right. And they lost money. They lost money charging. But at Acton, because the learners do everything themselves, the cost can be incredibly low. And they're also out doing apprenticeships at very early ages. They're out in the real world working.
But you're also not fielding sports teams. You don't have, you're not, this isn't part of the other kind of infrastructure that has become, as I look at the university systems around the country. Well, let me put it that I could opine here, but I know you're focused on grade school and high school. So let's talk for just a minute about the universities around the country. Do we have an excess? Do we have a surplus of universities in America?
Well, yes. And I would say, I would start with however many there are, that's the surplus.
They're football teams that happen to run a school. Is that but I asked that because there's, all these universities, there's a lot of expansion. They're building more buildings and spending more money on this, that, the other, but the baby boom is over. And the number of incoming high school seniors who are qualified to go into college has been declining and will continue to decline. So it seems like we've overbuilt that whole segment of the educational system. Is that's what it appears to me? Am I wrong?
Well, I can tell you what we see from the standpoint of Acton and Launchpadders, our high schoolers who are graduating. I don't believe any of them need college for any reason, except maybe they have to have a credential, so they have to have some sort of stamp to become a doctor or to become. So there might be some sort of credential issue. You have to hack a college degree, but I can tell you from our 2 sons who are at high-end colleges, they have not learned a single thing in college in their classes worthwhile. My opinion, not theirs. So I don't want to get them in trouble. That's me saying that as a father. I'll take my Acton hat off now, and I spent a lot of time in higher ed reform in a different point, non-Acton. I just think the failure of our universities is one of the great failures of time. And I'm not speaking politically. I could talk about that, and we could talk about the political correctness. That's not what I'm talking about. I just don't think the schools do a good job of people learning it. They charge enormous amounts of money and not very much learning goes on. And I believe in the next 10 and 20 years, we're going to see a collapse of that system. The Harvards of the world will still be around. The UT Austins will have a big endowment. They'll be around. But I believe you're going to see college fundamentally change because, at least for our graduates at Acton, it provides no value. not little value, no value, zero.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I mean, you went to a prestigious school, right? Harvard Business School, one of the most prestigious in the world, right? But those brands, Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, Brown, blah blah. We know those have power, particularly in the hiring marketplace, right? That the students who come out of those universities, they can be courted by the elite law firms, elite, accounting firms, elite consulting firms. I've seen this myself. So, but that doesn't jibe with what you're saying. You say you don't need that, but they are still, that credential still matters a lot in the marketplace or the job market. No,
it depends. So as a signal for I'm very smart, therefore I got into a prestigious college, it's a signal. And it's against the law to basically give employees an IQ test. So it is a very expensive IQ test in a way. So
a Stanford degree is just a very expensive IQ test.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, getting to hang around some very smart people at Stanford, and not to pick too much on Stanford. I would separate the Harvard Business School and the case method from Harvard University. I'd put all the Ivy Leagues and Stanford and all the other top universities and say they are in essence these days a very expensive IQ test, along with a lot of fun and climbing walls and some social conventions. And so they do that very well. And every once in a while they come up with research that might be valuable. That's I'm not sure if that's an accident or that's on purpose, but every once in a while it's actually really science that can be confirmed and it adds value. So, but let's go back to your statement. I think there's a great division coming between prestige and competence. So if you tell me that a Harvard degree or a Yale degree or pick your other campus would get me into, or Georgetown, let's pick that, will get me into the State Department or get me into law school or any group that where prestige matters, absolutely. What I'm speaking to is competence, the actual ability to do something, including, by the way, argue a case in court.
Right.
One thing to be a prestigious lawyer, there's another thing to be a litigant who does it well. So I think the world is going to divide between the competent, and that's what we see coming out of Acton Academy, and that's what I care about and our children care about, and the prestigious and hollow prestige. And I just think the world's dividing between one and the other, and I want to be on the competence side.
So, but I'll ask it again because I think it's, to me, as I look at it, it's a numbers game, right? That you have that I would say, put it this way, we've overbuilt higher education, right? We just have too many classrooms, too many buildings, too many dorms, given the number of students that are coming into that are qualified to be freshmen in college. Is it ultimately, you're talking about a prestige issue, you're talking about kind of a broader social thing, but I'm just wondering about just the raw numbers of people that have to fill the beds and the desks. Is there an oversupply?
Well, I think there's a demographic bubble going on, but saying
that's a good way to think about it.
I'm saying something much starker than that. I'm saying I do not believe they add any value to the lives of their students. That's what I'm saying. So yes, it's overbuilt, which means the emperor having no clothes, and in essence, it's educational fraud. That may be easier to uncover in a time of overcapacity, but the problem's not the overcapacity. The problem is the lack of value delivered to young people. And I see it every day. I mean, I've lived it. I've seen it. The system, the institutions are not designed for the good of the young people going into them, and they're not adding value. Period.
You know what pops into my mind and my guest, by the way, is Jeff Sandefer. He's the co-founder of Acton Academy. You can find out more about Acton Academy at actonacademy.org. And of course, you can look up Jeff. He has a long resume in business and energy business and so on, which we'll talk about in just a minute.
Hey, Robert, let me add something quickly because we didn't cover this. Not to horn, but I was at the graduate school at the University of Texas.
Right.
I was 5 times selected the outstanding teacher in the school. Business Week named me as one of the top 12 entrepreneurship professors in the country, and The Economist one of the top 10 business school professors in the world. So I spent a lot of time inside of higher. So I'm just not popping off about higher ed.
Right.
Spent a lot of time as a business person inside the halls of academia, up close and personal. I was on the board of Harvard Business School, different boards for 20 years. So I spent a lot of time in higher ed. And so what I'm saying is not just an aggrieved father. This is somebody who is inside the belly of the beast, and it's rotten. And I will also say that mission scandals, particularly at public universities like University of Texas, to allow the incompetent children of the rich and famous in, is absolutely against the law and goes on every day. And so it's just they're just corrupt institutions, period. I mean,
yeah. Well, so let me add to that, because it seems to me the game has changed even further with with now the professionalization of college sports with NIL, name, image, and likeness payments to athletes, right? They still like to call them student athletes, but it seems to me that Deion Sanders and the whole University of Colorado thing this year has just blown the door off the whole thing. No, it's all about cash. That this is the university's athletics programs are the university athletic programs are the ones driving the bus, and it's all about the money that they're generating for those athletes, but who are in fact professional at the college level now, which is, and maybe I don't know that that's far afield from what we're talking about here, but it seems to me kind of a further corruption of at the higher ed in general.
Oh, well, my late father was a football player. He played on the great Oklahoma teams that won 47 games straight, the Bud Wilkinson teams.
Your dad played for Bud Wilkinson? I didn't.
Yeah, Bud Wilkinson. He played for Breckenridge High School, where they won 3 state championships in a row. In fact, the players on his team that were a year younger than him never lost a game in high school or college if they went on to UT. I went on to OU. So the Breckenridge players that went on to OU never lost a game. So Dad was very integrally involved in college football and NCAA. And he was always furious that the athletes, many who came from poorer homes, generated millions of dollars of revenue for their schools and got nothing but a poor education. So he spent the latter part of his life championing, helping these young students when they graduated get jobs. And he would be delighted to see the fact they're finally getting paid, as opposed to the money going to oversized, inept university sports programs, all staffed by, I think UT's got $100 million a year budget.
Yeah. So it's more than that.
I'd rather see 20 million of that go to the players than go to a bunch of bureaucrats running the program.
And that's a fair point. But, one of the things I wrote down, and this is from a long time ago, and I grew up in Tulsa and watched Missouri Valley Conference basketball. And that was when Louisville was in the Missouri Valley Conference, and they played University of Tulsa. So they were rivals. But I remember there was a lot of discussion, and still is, about, bringing in students from disadvantaged homes, from low income neighborhoods, and then giving them scholarships. And Denny Crum, who was the longtime coach at Louisville, pointed out, he said, I'll go into these, you make these, you criticize me for, recruiting these students who, they are not the top students. They are not the valedictorians, salutatorians. But he said, I go in their homes and they don't have a magazine, a book one in the house. There's just not, they don't have the opportunities that other kids do. So to say they don't deserve this opportunity is wrong. And but to me, that reflects back. I mean, it seems relevant to me now about, well, if they're going to get to that level, well, by God, they should make some money, And so it rhymes with me. Let's go back to business. So now you started a business, the Acton Business School. That was very successful, but you closed that business as a business. You couldn't make a business of being in the business school business.
Well, we couldn't. Well, we made a business out of it for 20 years. We had terrific graduates. The problem was, we're going to see Acton Academy get to be 1,000 campuses, we believe, serving 100,000 young people. Our children's business fairs, which is another not-for-profit we have that helps young people start businesses as early as 5 years old up to 18. They come for a day and they have a business in someone's yard. We've just served our 93,000th customer in that business. And in the MBA program, we could only serve about 50 young people a year. Now, they were Navy SEALs, Olympic athletes, rising entrepreneurs. These were rock stars. But we looked at that, and the amount of effort it took to serve those 50 just wasn't of the scale of Acton Academy and the Acton Children's Business Fair. So we've got a whole new program going that we don't have to spend much time on today, but it's equipping young people to figure out what they want to do with their lives equipping them with the business tools, and then having them stand up and give a TEDx-like talk, like a TED talk, about who they are and where they're going.
Mm.
We're going to have about 400 of those talks. 400 people take those talks this spring. We had 100 or so last spring, and our foundation actually will give up to $100,000 per talk to help the young people find their vision. Now, most of the grants are $2,000 because they don't need 100,000, but we're hoping that that'll spread across the country, and we'll basically be able for young people to figure out what they want to do next with their lives, which may or may not involve college, stand up in a room and tell their story among people from the industry they want to go in. And that will be the recruiting mechanism where they will find their next great adventure in life. It's called the next great adventure. And so that is what the Acton MBA is becoming. It's transforming into something that hopefully can serve tens of thousands instead of just 50.
So it's almost like a pitch competition. It's almost like a VC, I'm thinking as you say that, these students are getting up and standing in front of potential employers and pitching themselves as their business. Is that a fair way to think about it?
First journey pitch contest. Yeah.
Huh.
And we just had one. I mean, these talks are amazing, but I'm thinking of one, this young girl who was 15, she may have been 16, stood up and she said she wanted to be an astrochemist. I had no idea what an astrochemist was, so she explained it. It's someone who studies chemistry on other planets.
Right.
Well, she goes into why she's interested, her backstory of her life, and what got her interested, and all the things she's done, including an apprenticeship at NASA. And I'll tell you, by the end of this, you're convinced she's going to be a rock star astrochemist. I mean, she is dedicated. She knows what she wants to do. She gives this 9-minute speech and records it. There's a 1-minute summary she also records. Well, it turns out that her mentor at NASA, Sergio, thought this was so great, he sent it to all of his friends. Well, she's now got multiple offers to study for graduate school before she goes into college. Because if you're a world-class astrochemist and you see this young girl's talk, you go, I want her working in my lab. I mean, she's going to be a rock star in astrochemistry. So these next great adventure talks are to get young people like this young woman that kind of exposure, and also some definition with what they want to do with their lives. What's their hero's journey? And for her, it's to become an astrochemist.
Well, it's interesting you talk about it that way. Well, because what I'm hearing as you're saying that, though, is they're also learning you got to pitch. Everybody's a salesperson, right? You got to sell your thing, right? You're selling your kit, you're selling your idea, you're selling yourself, right? But you're teaching them how to do the pitch because everybody's pitching. Everybody's pitching all the time, right? So well, let me ask you this. So how did you pitch? I mean, let's shift a little bit to your history in business. Cause I think, it's fair to say you were very successful in the oil and gas and the energy business. How did you learn how to pitch? How did you win a deal? I mean, I know you, my first book was on Enron. In fact, I first met you when this is a long time ago, when I was working on my first book, Pipe Dreams. And we met at a restaurant downtown Austin. It was 24 or 5 years ago now. Book came out and they went bankrupt in 2002, right? December 1st, 2002. So I think it was in early 2003. How did you learn how to pitch? Because you were pitched deals to make your first businesses happen. How did you learn how to pitch?
Well, I was fortunate. My grandfather made his money picking on small oil fields in small towns. So he was kind of a junk dealer in a way. My father came out of OU after playing football, and he was a wildcatter. So he was like the wildcatters of old, raising money to drill these expensive, risky wells. And so I grew up, across the family breakfast table, hearing him talk about pitching deals. So I was exposed to it at a very young age. Loved being at Harvard Business School, learned a lot about thinking and asking the right question. And, most of pitching is actually thinking about who the person is on the other side of the table and if you can serve them. It's not really, as you well know, it's not like pitching at someone. It's understanding them and if there's something you have to offer. So, I had done quite a bit of that. And at age 28, I was 26. When I graduated from Harvard Business School, I pitched to a utility the idea of me starting an oil and gas firm in the Gulf of Mexico. And a man named Mark Peterson believed in me. And at a time when no one else could get money in the oil business, he funded my first few deals. And we turned $1 million initial investment into $500 million in profits in 4 years, because that man believed enough in me. And I'm sure my pitch was terrible, actually. The pitch probably wasn't very good. The idea was good. I had some competence as an engineer, and he knew I wanted it desperately. So I told a good story about myself, and Mark Peterson believed in me. And, we built an incredible company in a very short time period. And that ended up being, after that, I built a number of other businesses, but that was kind of the first one.
So if I'm reading it back to you, the secret to the good pitch is understanding the pitchee and what the pitchee wants.
Yeah. And if you can serve them, and if you can't, you shouldn't be pitching, right? You're wasting your time and their time. You need to understand, could you do it? And it's a longer story, but there was actually something we had that Mark Peterson really needed and really helped him a lot. And so it was a marriage made in heaven.
And where was Peterson? What was the business?
He was in a utility. He was working for a subsidiary of a utility, and he was doing natural gas brokerage. And we could provide him the feedstock he needed to broker to get a better position inside his utility. Uh-huh. So there was a gain, and we could do it at a lower price than anyone else. Now, he still had to believe, this 26-year-old kid, that he could put $100 million with us and we wouldn't embarrass him. I mean, now he gave it to us a few $1 at a time. He wasn't dumb. He didn't give us the whole 100 million, but that turned out to be a great partnership. And that was where I learned pitching is about listening and seeing if you can serve somebody.
And your timing was right, because this would be the late 80s, early 90s, right after natural gas is deregulated. So you had an open field in terms of the ability to provide gas into the marketplace and where it could be marketed, right? Because the deregulation that occurred during the George H.W. Bush administration, if I'm remembering. And this was also the early days of Enron getting into the gas business as well in the deregulated, less regulated market, I guess.
Well, and just as importantly, this is coming off of the oil boom in the early 1980s, late 70s and early 80s, and the major oil companies had bid billions of dollars for Gulf of Mexico blocks that they could no longer drill. And we show up with no debt, no history, and we want to drill those blocks, and the majors have no budget and no people. So the timing was perfect that we were it was the worst time in the world to get in the oil business, which means it was the best time in the world to get in the oil business. So we came into it when the industry was in a slump and recovering, and the timing was just perfect. And by the way, that's pure luck. That's not like smart timing. That was just, we were at the right place at the right time.
Well, luck is when opportunity meets preparation, right? That is the old line. So what about the energy? I know that you pride yourself on some of the energy programs, energy, what am I'm going to say program within Acton Academy. But why this is a broad question that applies, I guess, within Acton as well, but more broadly, the general public, why is it difficult for people in general, policymakers and the public and at large, to understand energy as a concept? What is it that makes it difficult to get and so easy to be, hype and in terms of particularly renewables and some of these other things? Why is it so difficult for people to understand it?
Well, I think it's difficult because I turn on the light switch, the light comes on, it's a miracle. I get in my car, I turn the ignition. When my car is low on fuel, I go to the gas pump, and in 2 minutes, I fill it back up with gasoline, and it takes me further. So they're miracles. And what I don't think people have is an understanding of the thermodynamics, the physics, the real science behind them. And you mentioned Acton Academy. We have these quests, which are 6-week hands-on projects that young people do. And I'll give an example of one of them we do in the middle school and the Launchpad, the high school. It's called the electricity quest. And the question is, the big question is, does power corrupt for the year? Power being the kind of power you and I talk about, and also, right. And then the question for this quest is, are great cities planned, or do they emerge? And so we take Robert Moses, who built this New York City, and Jane Jacobs, who believed that cities should emerge. And those are the two villains and heroes of the quest. Now, what the young people do is they build a city like a physical city with lights, and they have to wire that city, and then they have to decide what kind of fuel are they going to use to power that grid. And in 6 weeks, I'm telling you, Robert, they're up till midnight, every night for 3 weeks building these cities. And at the end of the day, they turn a switch and the lights come on, the cities light up. And then during these exhibitions where the public comes at the end of the 6 weeks, the trick was, how long will your city stay lighted? Did you buy the right fuel? And so what the young people learn from that is they learn electricity, they learn how the grid works. By the way, it starts out with you've got your own little block of the city you do, but to win, you have to cooperate by adding other blocks and other people. But guess what? Your wiring was 6 volts and mine was 9 volts. Uh-oh. So guess what? That's just how cities got wired. That's exactly what happened when they got wired. They got, there was all this confusion about creating the grid. So in that, though, they learn the physics of electricity. They learn the issues of power generation. And so we have a similar quest in the elementary studio where they have to gather sticks, mine for coal, which is digging up marbles, or play battleship to look for oil and gas. And then they have to decide, this is the elementary level, of what they've gathered, how do they sell it into a market? And they learn energy density. They learn it's harder to gather wood than it is to look for oil and gas. And and there's also renewables involved in the game. So they play a game that over 6 weeks teaches them how energy really works. So anyway, it's hands-on, it's the real world, the economics are embedded in the politics. And our learners actually understand how energy works.
That's I think that's essential. What you're, I think Jacob went through that when he was at Acton, but I don't recall it. But it is so essential, that hands-on understanding, because it's interesting to use Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, because New York City, of course, was where the first central power plant was, of course, with the Pearl Street station in Lower Manhattan that Edison built. But it still is evolving, and the difficulties of making that system work in the city of New York. It's just a gargantuan engineering challenge. And I think you're right. I think we take it, because it's so simple, because it's been around for so long, and it usually always works. We take it for granted. People take it for granted without understanding the complexities of the system. And the complexities are just staggering.
If you're an Acton learner and you stayed up for 3 days straight wiring your city, and you turn it on and you melt the grid, you never forget what happens when you melt the grid.
Right.
I have a feeling that we're going to be melting some grids in this country if we're not careful pretty soon. And, melting the grid will not be a good thing. And the Acton learners will understand in the deep inside their souls what it means to melt the grid, where the average American won't.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely key, right? To understanding the thingness of this. I'd like to say the thingness of the thing, right? There's a lot of policy that's being made around the grid, but the people who are pushing this policy don't understand what that thing means, right? The transformers, the wires, the bucket trucks, the linemen, they have no concept of it, right? Well, of course it works, right? But no understanding of, we have more than 3,000 electricity providers. We have all these regional transmission organizations, 2,000 publicly owned utilities. It's a miracle it all works. I mean, it just truly is miraculous that it works, but it does. And so we're just kind of coasting, I think, on the fact that it does work and assuming that it always will, which is a big assumption. So you're not, so you're in the business of the Acton Academy. And again, Jeff is the co-founder of Acton Academy. You can find out more about it at actonacademy.org. But you're not in the business, you're not in the energy business anymore. You're not doing other business, you're not investing. Why not? I mean, could you not do that as well? Or is this is your purpose, the business of schooling these, creating this system of network of campuses? That's your business. That's your only pursuit these days.
Well, so this might actually be a good place for us to end. I'll tell you a story of how that happened. So I went to see Bernie Marcus, who is the founder of Home Depot, and a delightful guy. And it was introduced by a mutual friend. I didn't know who Bernie Marcus was, and I went to see him in Florida, and he said to me, "I want to build 100 Acton business schools. It's the greatest thing I've ever seen. I want to build them all over the country." And I said, "Well, Bernie, we had 20 in different universities. We had Acton Business School, Acton MBA teachers teaching in 20 universities. And every place we did that, the tenured faculty took it over and fired our teachers. So I would expand it to 100 places if I knew how to do that. And so Bernie and I spent the rest of the day together. And at the end of the day, he came to me and he said, "Son, do you mind if an old man gives you some advice?" And I said, "No, sir." And he said, "I'm 78 years old. I'm worth $2.2 billion. Last year, I built, financed, planned, and staffed, and then turned over a $250 million aquarium in Atlanta to the city of Atlanta. And by the way, if you're ever in Atlanta, the Bernie Marcus Aquarium is the most amazing aquarium I've ever been in. I've been in dozens. Mm. It's incredible." So Bernie said, "I did that. And yet every night I go to bed worried that I'm going to die and someone's going to use the money that I've left in a way that harms people, because philanthropy is the hardest thing on earth. And you can do a lot of damage." And he said, and this is what stayed with me. He said, "Every dollar you make from now on will be a burden to you, not a blessing. And so you need to go home and get out of business and spend all your time on acting." And he was.
And how long ago was this?
That would have been 10 years ago. Mm. And on the plane back that night, I said, "You know what? There's a guy that's way ahead of me trying to give me some advice. And I know he's speaking the truth. And I made the decision on the plane on the way home that night. I was going to sell everything and I was going to get out of business and concentrate on acting." So that's the reason I've done that, is Bernie Marcus's words.
So, well, I wrote this question down, so I'll just put it to you. I get it. It's an interesting idea or interesting advice that he gave to you, but you could also be, wealthy people do, right? They collect vintage stamps or vintage boats or, bigger, whatever it is, but that doesn't, your passion now is the school. Then this is what your focus is for the rest of we're the same age. I think you're 63 as well, right? So no other plans then, no other assumption, no other goals besides growing Acton Academy?
Well, not at this moment. We'll see how much longer you and I have. Maybe I'll come up with another plan. But no, at the moment, it's Acton Academy. It's the Children's Business Fair, and it's this Next Great Adventure program until we find something better.
So why do you care? Why do you care so much?
Because I see what these young people can do. It's just extraordinary. I want them freed to be able to become who they were meant to be. And, that's going to be a lifelong task and then some. And we're so lucky because the 325 owners that we have are just extraordinary people. And these learners, when you meet them, I went to an Acton, one of our Actons that serves kind of lower income families last year. And I walked in the door and this young man met me and he said, no one knew who I was or I was coming. And the young man walked up, I walked up and he said, "Welcome to our school. You should read this book." And he handed me a copy of Laura's book, Courage to Grow. And
where's the school?
It's in Memphis. And I turned it around and I pointed to her picture on the back and I said, "You know what? That's my wife." And the young man said, "That blows my mind." And he took me around as the ambassador and he showed me all around the school. He still didn't understand I was the co-founder and they just knew I was married to the lady on the book. And we got to the end and I asked him, I said, "What is so special about Acton, to you?" And he said, "It's the freedom." And almost all learners will say that. And the next thing he said, almost all learners say too. And he said, "But you know one thing? Freedom comes with responsibility." You have as much responsibility as much freedom. Robert, that young man was 5.5 years old.
So that's your payoff.
That's
your profit.
I mean, that kid is going to change the world. He's going to do something extraordinary. And he was, his generosity, his courtesy, the way he could speak, his excitement, his curiosity, that kid's going to go do something amazing. And not because I did anything. I just want to be around and watch him. I just want to know what he's going to do because it's fun to watch. I want to watch what Jacob's going to do. I can't wait to see what Charlie and Sam, our sons, what they're going to do. So,
but that's the thrill. Then that's the motivation. Then
just fun to be a part of it.
So who do you admire? Who are your, I admire, it sounds like you have a lot of admiration for your dad. I have a lot of admiration for my late father as well. But when you look around now, people are, name a few people who are living that you admire and think are really making a difference in the world. Positive difference.
Well, it's hard for me because my world's pretty small in a way now. I I'm really serving all these different owners, and so I think we have uh, Ali, who's one of our owners in Lahore, Pakistan, has 130 learners. He's got two adults, and when you see his launch padders, his high schoolers, they're running the whole place. And I look at that and I say, how did this guy go to Lahore, Pakistan, and build the best Acton Academy we have? How did he possibly pull that off? And so I go from campus to campus and I see the owners what they're doing, and then I see these high schoolers and middle schoolers and what they're building. And so I don't spend a lot of time I loved Margaret Thatcher. I spent a lot of time with Lady Thatcher. I never knew Ronald Reagan, but I was William F. Buckley. I spent a lot of time with Bill Buckley, and he's a hero of mine. But those were all heroes from afar. What I enjoy today is seeing the heroes up close. And so I just don't spend a lot of time thinking about the big questions of politics, because I spend a lot of time thinking about the big questions inside an Acton. A lot more fun.
Okay, well, so then what about? I know you're a voracious reader. We've talked about many books, and but when in public intellectuals today, public that are in the public sphere, politicians today, there anyone that you admire what they're doing?
It would be more shallow, like Instagram. I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on any social media, but it'd be that kind of comment, because I'm not up close enough to any of those people to know.
Fair enough.
No, yeah, I love reading Tom Sowell. I give you a long list of authors that I love to read, but I don't know anything about them other than I love their books.
Well, then let's talk about that, because if you've listened to the podcast, I ask everyone who is a guest, what are you reading now? What books are on the top of your pile?
Let's see. I've got A History of God sitting right here, so I know that's there. I just read
A History of God is the name of the book.
Yeah, History of God by Karen Armstrong. It just happens to be sitting in front of me. I just got through reading Infinity, which is Michael Lewis's new book about SBF, which is
Sam Bankman-Fried. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also just finished. I'm going to blank on the title. Radical Uncertainty, which is a book about decision making and how you think about decision making. It's about Knightian uncertainty from Frank Knight at the University of Chicago. And it's just a great way to think about how the unexpected in the world is perhaps what creates most of the value. So it's about entrepreneurship and thinking about risk and uncertainty. So those are the three I have within eyesight right now that I can see.
Well, I said it was my last question, but you mentioned entrepreneurship, and I have to ask you because you've taught entrepreneurship. And so this is the bonus question, because it wasn't even on my list here, but it pops in my head that I would fail as an interviewer if I don't ask. You've taught entrepreneurship. You've started and sold businesses. What makes a good entrepreneur?
Yeah. My friend and former professor Amar Bidet said that the one trait, if you study entrepreneurs, that is different between entrepreneurs and the general public is something called a tolerance for ambiguity. And what he means by the word ambiguity, if you ask him to explain it, he said ambiguity is being able to stand there and say, see that mountain? That's where we're headed. And you rally people around you because you're so sure that that's the mountain. And as soon as you set off with your merry little band towards the mountain and the Holy Grail, you say to yourself quietly, that's probably not the right mountain. I know it's the right mountain now, but as I get closer, I'm probably going to have to change course, because if you're too sure, you're going to run off a cliff. But if you're not believing enough to be able to say, and so he said the tolerance for ambiguity is to be able to hold in your mind those 2 points, which really aren't lying, because right now, you're sure that's the mountain. You're equally sure you're wrong. And you're going to charge off into the uncertainty. And that very few people can hold those two opposing thoughts in their brain at the same time and move forward. And I think that's the hero's journey. And that's what creates competence. And it really is the courage to go forward. And that's the tolerance for ambiguity is what separates most entrepreneurs from the rest of the world.
Well, I'm glad I asked that question because I like that answer. That's very interesting. The other thing that pops in my head is that's a sophisticated mind, is this idea of holding two conflicting ideas, right, in your mind at one time, or two or more, I guess, conflicting ideas. But I like that idea, tolerance for ambiguity. My guest has been my friend, Jeff Sandefer. He's the founder of Acton Academy, which is now has 325 campuses around the world in 42 countries. Is that right? Did I get, no, 24 countries, 26 countries.
42 states, close.
In 42 states. You can find out more at actonacademy.org about his work in education, which is truly remarkable and has affected my own family. So I'm glad that we could finally make this happen, Jeff.
Robert, great to be with you.
And to all of you out there in podcast land, tune into the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. It might be as good as this one. Well, let's hope so. Until then, see you.